The first line in my notebook from that day is not about the ambush. It is not about the valley or the smoke or the 31 Marines who came home alive. The first line is something Captain Vira said about her an hour before the mission launched, and for 3 days after, I almost crossed it out. I thought it wasn't the story. I was wrong about that the same way he was. I had been embedded at FOB Drenner for 11 days. I was there to write about rotary wing close air support operations, the coordination, the speed, the gap between a radio call and a gun run. I had a press credential, a cot in the transient tent, and a notebook that a sergeant had already told me I would need to keep out of certain briefings. I understood the rules. I stayed in my lane that morning. I was on the flight line at ZO 515. Two Apaches were being prepped for a support mission into a narrow valley the operations map called Sector 14, a resupply route that had been hit 3 times in the previous month. The crew assignments were posted on the board outside the ready room. I copied them into my notebook because that was the job. She was listed as pilot in command for the second bird. I did not know what I was looking at yet. I wrote the name down and moved on. Vera came out at 0530. He was a captain, broad across the shoulders, the kind of officer who moved through a space as though he had already decided its geometry. He looked at the board, called to the operations sergeant, and said, clearly enough that I could hear it from 8 feet away, "Pull Carver off the manifest. Her certification lag hasn't cleared. Give her post-flight inspection on Bird 2 when they return." The operations sergeant said, "Yes, sir," and changed the board. That is the first line in my notebook. Pull Carver off the manifest. I wrote it because it was the moment something shifted on the flight line. A small shift, almost invisible, the kind that turns out to matter. The crew chief 2 feet from me exhaled through his nose. A door gunner looked away. No one said anything. She came out 4 minutes later. I will say this plainly. She did not look like what I expected a combat pilot to look like. I don't mean that as an insult. I had spent 11 days watching the way this place sorted itself. Who walked to the front of a briefing room, who deferred to whom, whose voice filled a space when something went sideways, and she had been mostly outside that sorting. Quiet. Peripheral. I had seen her on the flight line before dawn 3 mornings in a row, hands on aircraft she was not scheduled to fly, checking things the maintenance crews had already checked. I thought she was thorough. I thought she was anxious. I had written methodical in my notes and moved on. She read the board, looked at it for 2 seconds, picked up the clipboard from the rack beneath it, and turned toward the hangar without a word. Vera watched her go. He said nothing else. I wrote, "Does not argue." That was it. I did not know yet what to do with it. The 2 birds lifted at 6:07. I watched them clear the wire, the rotor wash kicking dust across the flight line, and then they were over the ridge and gone. I went to the T to file some background notes. The interpreter assigned to my embed was asleep in a chair. A specialist was eating cold rice from a tin. It was a quiet morning until it wasn't. The first radio call came at 0714. Lead bird down. Tail rotor failure on a hard bank. Crew alive. Aircraft in a dry creek bed 3 kilometers south of the objective. Second bird was diverted to cover, took small arms fire through the engine cowling, and was nursing back toward ward base with one pilot handling the controls and the other managing an oil pressure warning that was moving in the wrong direction. Sector 14 had 31 Marines in a resupply convoy that had walked into an ambush on the southern access road. They had 2 wounded. They were in a ravine with no clean egress and no air support. The operations officer pulled up the board. Nearest available CAS asset was 40 minutes out. I walked outside to write that down somewhere quiet. She was already crossing the flight line. Not jogging, walking. The kind of walking that has a destination built into it, the kind that does not need to announce itself. She had the helmet under her arm. The clipboard was on the table outside the hangar. I saw it as I came around the corner, face down, set aside cleanly, like something completed. I didn't call out to her, I don't know why, I just watched. She had been on that aircraft, the third bird, the one sitting in the revetment that no crew had touched since Euro 430. She had been on it that morning before sunrise. I had seen her. I thought she was doing the post-flight inspection early out of habit, getting ahead of the work Vera had assigned her. I had written nothing about it because it seemed like background. A pilot doing busy work because she'd been benched. She had been pre-flighting it, not post-flighting. Pre-flighting. In the dark. 2 hours before anyone knew the other birds would be unavailable. I do not know if she knew. I have thought about this for a long time and I still do not know. What I know is what I saw. She had gone through that aircraft the way I have seen experienced surgeons go through a tray before a procedure, not rushing, not performing. Just knowing where every instrument was, and what it weighed, and whether the count was right. She climbed into the cockpit at 0731. The operations officer came out at 0733. He looked at the revetment. He looked at me. He said, "Who cleared that?" I said I didn't know. He went inside and I heard Vera's voice rise once, sharply, and then go flat and stop. She was airborne at 0736. What happened in the next 23 minutes I can only reconstruct from two sources. The radio traffic, which I wrote down as fast as I could in the doorway of the TOC, and the crew chief who stood on the roof of the maintenance bay with a pair of binoculars and told me quietly, without looking at me, what he saw. First gun run at 0741. She came in from the north slope, low and fast, broke left after the pass, and the ravine below went quiet. The convoy commander's radio call came 40 seconds later. Eastern elements suppressed. They were moving. Second run at 0748. She took fire. The crew chief said, "She's hit," and then said nothing for a long moment, and then said, "She's not leaving." The convoy was still in the ravine. The western element had shifted, and she went back in. Third run at 0754. By then, one engine was producing partial power, and the hydraulics were telling a story no one wanted to hear. The crew chief's knuckles were white on the binoculars. He said, "She's making the third pass." That is all he said. The convoy broke out of the ravine at 0757 and began moving toward the extraction point. She landed at 0759. The rotor was still turning when Vera crossed the flight line. I followed because I was a correspondent, and following was the job, but I will admit I was not thinking about my notebook at that moment. I was thinking about the aircraft, which had one engine out and scorch marks across the cowling, and a rotor housing that the crew chief would later describe as somewhere between functional and a question mark. She climbed down, pulled off the helmet. Her hair was sweat flat against the side of her face, and there was a grease smear on her jaw from the cockpit frame that she didn't know was there. She stood still for a second, the way a person does when the ground feels different than the air did 30 seconds ago. Vera stopped 2 feet from her. He reached inside his flight jacket and took out the mission manifest, his copy, the one he had personally amended at 0530 that morning. He held it out. She looked at it but didn't take it. He set it on the step of the aircraft beside her. He squared his shoulders. He brought his right hand up, clean and deliberate, and he held the salute. She returned it. 4 counts, level. I did not write anything for a long time after that. The flight line did not move. That is the only way I know how to say it. The crew chief on the roof was still. The specialist who had been eating rice from a tin was standing at the corner of the TOC with his hands at his sides. 31 Marines were moving toward a landing zone 3 kilometers south, and on the flight line at Fob Drenner, the only sound was the aircraft cooling and the wind coming off the eastern ridge. She picked up the manifest, folded it once, and put it in her pocket. She walked past Vera and kept going toward the maintenance bay. Vera watched her until she was inside. Then he turned and walked back to the operations center without a word, and I thought, that is a man who knows exactly what he did this morning and has decided how he is going to carry it. My dispatch never ran. My editor said the story was too contained, too small. 1 pilot, 1 aircraft, 1 valley. He said there wasn't enough context for the piece to land. I didn't argue with him. I understood what he meant, and I knew he was wrong, but I understood it. The notebook is in a box on a shelf in my apartment. I have looked at it maybe 30 times in the years since. The first line is still there, the one about the manifest, and 3 pages later, there are the radio timestamps and the crew chief's words in the margin and the rough word salute underlined twice because I couldn't think of anything else to write. And at the very back, on the inside of the back cover, there is a name, my spelling, my handwriting, and below it, in a different hand, compact square letters, the kind of penmanship that belongs to someone who fills out logbooks for a living. The correct spelling, with no other comment. She found my notebook somewhere in the hour after she landed. She opened to the back cover. She crossed out my error and wrote it right. She didn't say anything to me about it. I was probably at the TUC. By the time I came back to my cot, she was already at the aircraft again, doing the post-flight inspection Vera had assigned her that morning. She finished the work she had been given. That is what I know about Pale Hammer. That is all I have ever needed to know.